and the fact that we were one of the first countries to actually legalize, at the time they called it gay marriages, but basically to make sure that same-sex marriages were legalized. So we have, as a country, continued to improve our various pieces of legislation to make sure that this community is accommodated adequately. Our Refugees Act, which we administer here, the Department of Home Affairs, Act 130 of 1998, as well as the amendments that came after that, actually recognizes the persecution of people based on their sexual orientation and gender identity as valid grounds for asylum. So we do issue asylum on that basis. However, we also acknowledge that even though our laws are clear, in practice, there's a practical realization of these rights for individuals seeking asylum actually remains inconsistent. And this is mainly because various beliefs, still some resistance by some people in the community, as well as some officials within Home Affairs. Now, in terms of the special measures that the DHA has taken, I first actually looked at our legal recognition. Firstly, the Refugees Amendment Act of 2022, which affirms the right to seek asylum on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And then I also looked at DHA guidelines, which we have aligned with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees standards, where we instruct refugee reception officers as well as status determination officers to assess these cases, claims with the level of sensitivity that is actually required. Another special measure that we've taken is that over the years, we have had to really work on improving our training and capacity building. We come from various backgrounds, and even though our constitution is very clear, there are still some people in our communities who may have different views, and therefore realizing and recognizing that in the past, DHA recruitment did not necessarily take in these opinions into consideration. So what we're now doing is to make sure that the people that are present, that are working in our spaces and engaging with this community are actually trained. And we have had to collaborate with non-state organizations to make sure that adequate training takes place. I will just name a few. We've collaborated with the UNHCR. We've collaborated with Scalabrini. We have collaborated with the Lawyers for Human Rights as well to make sure that officials who deal with asylum seekers and refugees are trained in issues of human rights as well as the rights of LGBTQIA plus refugees and asylum seekers. The Refugees Appeals Authority of South Africa, which is RASA, actually has collaborative engagements with the UNHCR to make sure that their adjudicators as well, their appeal adjudicators in that entity also are better equipped to assess claims of this nature, as in claims relating to gender-based prosecutions. Now, we also looked at, in terms of detention, as well as safe housing, and we are very much aware that, there's a huge absence of safe housing and shelter specifically dedicated to LGBTQIA plus individuals. Not just the refugees and asylum seekers, but the South African ones as well. And so it's a discussion that we need to have as a country, not just the Department of Home Affairs, but a lot of people need to come in and engage and collaborate to make sure that there are safe options for those who need to be accommodated. Now, unfortunately, fortunately, we as a country do not have an encampment policy. So when we encounter or when we adjudicate claims relating to LGBTQIA plus refugees and asylum seekers, there is an expectation, just like there is for every other asylum seekers and refugee, that they self-integrate into the community. We do not offer accommodation. Now, we also do not offer any alternative to detention in case one of the community members may find themselves in such. However, this is really not that much of an issue, because one thing I can tell you, and it's not because I'm addressing this group specifically, but because it is true, the LGBTQIA plus community is actually one of the most compliant groups of asylum seekers and refugees where the rules are concerned. So there would hardly ever be a case that would require somebody having to be detained at Lindela and then ultimately deported back to their country of origin. However, yes, there would be seldom, every once in a while, and in that case, they do have to be treated equally, just like all the other asylum seekers and refugees, or all the other people that are scheduled for deportation. Now, we looked at the policy and the implementation gaps. I think it was one of the guidelines that I was provided. We can admit that there is inconsistent application of guidelines. I mean, despite the fact that in terms of policy and legislation, there is clear recognition, but where implementation is concerned, you would spot inconsistencies in some cases. Like if you were to engage with members of this community, they may have different experiences based on whom was assisting them at the Department of Home Affairs office. Many of our officers, or some of our officers, still lack understanding and they remain biased, which leads to flawed adjudication of LGBTQIA plus asylum claims. That is something that we need to address. And then sometimes even the training provided to officials working in this environment may not necessarily be adequate enough for them to understand in detail the issues and therefore apply that knowledge effectively. So there is a need to improve the type of training that we give them. Another gap or another challenge that we've identified is in terms of documentation. There could be delays in terms of documentation, which will ultimately affect the applicant in this case. And I was saying these individuals face prolonged delays in obtaining documentation, more especially if the person encounters an official that may not be properly trained or may be biased with backwards traditional views that do not necessarily respect this community in the manner that it should be respected. And obviously, these delays then now they exacerbate their vulnerability and therefore could possibly lead to exploitation, xenophobia, and may even contribute to violence. So that is something that we really had to acknowledge. Now, we're saying it's important to note that these delays are, some of them are not unique to LGBTQIA plus community, but they are applicable to all the other refugees and asylum seekers as well. And then, of course, as I've already mentioned, the lack of dedicated facilities and safe spaces. Pretty much the moment they come into the country, they would be treated almost the same as everybody else, or in terms of location, they would be placed in the same facilities with everybody else, and with that vulnerability not being taken into account. However, we do recognize that equal treatment is in line with the Constitution, and this is definitely encouraged. But we also do recognize that while we try to encourage equal treatment, it is possible that this the absence of such facilities and spaces can still have potential to expose them to discrimination and victimization within the refugee population, refugee and asylum seeker population, as well as eventually when they do self-integrate into South African societies. We also take note of some reports. The South African civil society organizations are very active, and some have really clearly documented the challenges that this community faces, including highlighting frequent harassments and victimizations by law enforcement as well as other state actors. So it's not just Home Affairs, but other law enforcement entities as well. And therefore, this would, in my view, call for a much broader discussion at a national level with other role players. And then another gap that we have, the last gap that we identified was in terms of limited data and monitoring. So there's very little data disaggregated by sexual orientation or gender identity as well. And, this sort of hampers now effective policy making and targeted support interventions. So you would find that we would make assumptions based on what they present to us, but also what we document, what we record, and what we are allowed to record. There are limits to that. What we share as well, and what other entities share as well, there are limits to that, especially now in the days of POPIA. So that contributes to the data disaggregation. Now, we made a few recommendations as we, as Home Affairs, continue to try to improve this area improve our policies and standard operating procedures and trainings relating to this community. For now, we're recommending mandatory nationwide training for all DHA officers, particularly dealing with refugees and asylum seekers. Obviously, because of the financial implications, we would have to work hard in terms of collaborating with other entities as well as non-state sector to make sure that we obtain the necessary funding to make sure that all of this very important and crucial training takes place. But it shouldn't be that some officials are trained and others are not, or some are adequately trained and others are not. We need to make sure that there's uniformity and that every LGBTQIA plus member who find themselves in the offices of Home Affairs or dealing with DHA officials have the same positive experience. We also obviously need to improve our collaboration with the groups representing LGBTQIA plus individuals, particularly the refugee and asylum seeker organizations, if they're out there. I think because we do not have data, they may actually have much more information and data that could actually assist us. And then also the creation of non-state funded safe spaces and support services tailored for LGBTQIA plus refugee needs. This is just in relation to what I mentioned earlier with, we currently have the detention facility in Lindela, and that's basically for everyone, irrespective of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, based on the different sensitivities and vulnerabilities identified in these communities, if the country as a whole feels like, there's a need to provide safe spaces, then we need to have a much broader discussion as government to see how this can be done. Because I am of the view that it is not just the LGBTQIA plus refugees and asylum seekers, but it's the LGBTQIA plus entire community, including South Africans, who are affected. And then another recommendation that we made is, and we're already working towards this one, It's our two entities, RASA and SCRA. RASA being the Refugee Appeals Authority of South Africa, and then the Standing Committee on Refugees Affairs, which is SCRA. Both of them have serious backlogs in relation to asylum seekers and refugee matters. Now, some of the cases are cases of people who are claiming asylum on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, we're saying if we could reduce these backlogs, it would definitely ensure timely confirmations or final rejections of the application status, which means that now this committee would, once instead of just being delayed and not knowing where you stand with the country, it's better if you have a final decision and you're able to work out what to do next. Do I appeal or do I go home and look for alternative ways or find a different country? Whatever it is that you decide, delays are just not good for anybody. Also, what happens to you while there are delays in adjudicating your claim? It could be anything. You could be exposed to exploitation, violence, harassment, xenophobia. So really working on the backlogs in RASA and SCRA, in addition to other measures such as training DHA officials, would all go a long way in improving our engagement and the experience of this community with the Department of Home Affairs in general. Now, in conclusion, I just want to say that even though as a country we do have strong legal framework, we do take into account the inadequacies in the implementation, and we continue to work on making improvement mechanisms with the hope of creating safer environments that people would not be deterred to approach when they require assistance. And we're saying the DHA will continue to collaborate with partners. We're also open to new partners, especially those that can assist in training our officials to ensure that the LGBTQIA plus refugees and asylum seekers are treated with the dignity and enjoy the equal access to the rights enshrined in the Constitution. That is the end of my notes. Thank you very much, Chairperson. I will pause here for questions.
Thank you so much, Diketso Ratau, for that those remarks. What we're going to do now is that we're going to allow for a 10-minute session where we can get to ask Diketso some questions because they do have to leave. They did indicate earlier in the meeting. What I'm going to do is look at my screen. If there are any questions, please can you raise your hand and you can briefly introduce yourself and then you can ask your question directly. The floor is now open to ask questions. I'm just looking at my screen. All right, I see a question from Tinashe. So Tinashe, please may you kindly open your mic and quickly introduce yourself and then you may ask the question.
Thank you so much, Busisiwe Ngiyabonga. Greetings to all the leaders, comrades in this call. My name is Tinashe Wakapila. I'm an asylum seeker living in South Africa from Zimbabwe. And my question is specifically more of a suggestion as well to pick the brain or the mind of the strategy or mitigation plans that have been put in place for asylum seekers who are already in the system, like me. I just wanted to pose a question to say, has there been any strategies to place LGBTQI desk spaces in the RSDO offices or wherever there's a refugee reception center? In Durban, where I got mine, there wasn't any. And as you have mentioned that everybody has to be treated equally, there is also the right of freedom of expression and choice. And I'm sure no matter how much training we could give to some of the Home Affairs or RSD or refugee officers, They also have got the right to choose whether they should accept a queer person in their own personal capacity. But it also affects their determination as to a person deserves a refugee status or claim. So yeah, that's the first question. Are there any LGBTIQ desks or any strategies that could be placed to say for specific group like ours, they can place a person who has an understanding or a further brief? Then another suggestion for the centers, if they could probably, because the refugees is a broad spectrum. We are not the only ones seeking for asylum because of the fears that we have. But for displaced people, they are organizations that refugee asylum seeker owned, that are working, to make sure that whenever a queer person flees from persecution in their respective countries, they arrive at. If maybe the Home Affairs officials could also kind of work hand in hand with them, so that maybe it could speed up the process of settling or resettlements, etc. Is there any plan or strategy that they have implemented to reach out to those spaces as well? Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Dikatsa to answer, I just want to check if there are any other questions. The floor is still open. All right, I do see a hand from Winston. Winston, you may ask a question, and then I'll check if there's a third question, then hand over back to you. All right, so Winston, the floor is yours. Please may you unmute and quickly introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Winston Barry Kulunji, and I identify as a trans woman, and I'm an asylum seeker, newly arrived here in South Africa. And I want to thank the previous speaker for sharing such deep insights from the Department of Home Affairs. And my question is, how does the Department of Home Affairs improve access to information and resources for newly asylum seekers in South Africa? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ms. Winston. I'm just going to check again for the last question before I hand over back to our speaker. Okay, from the looks of my screen, I don't see a question. I'm going to hand over back to Diketso to please answer the questions that have been asked. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions and for the suggestions. I'm going to start with Tinashe's suggestions. First of all, the issue of desks would be challenging for a number of reasons. We are obligated to provide equal treatment while still taking into account the various sensitive natures of each case. But if there were to be a little desk at the corner over there and then everybody else on the side, that may not necessarily pan out the way that we may hope that it would. It could create issues. But apart from that, to say we would find separate people from DHA officials who would then sit on these desks, automatically then that brings in the issue of financial costs, because there's just no way it would be a free service unless those people were going to just volunteer their service. And I don't think that would be fair. Now, with the route that the South African government is taking of trying to reduce costs as much as possible, I don't think getting additional people to work on dedicated desks is going to work. Something that you did mention, though, with regard to the behavior of the officials and how they have the right to not accept you in their personal space. I think we should understand that as public service officials, we are obligated by law to treat people equally. There is a public service code of conduct. So the moment you enter into that office, no one is supposed to make you feel like they are addressing you in their personal capacity or their personal space. It's not their personal space. They are officials on duty, and they're supposed to follow rules and specific procedures irrespective of how they feel inside, and actually how they feel should not in any way influence their work, their adjudication, or the outcome of your claim. They're only supposed to be dealing with facts. So in that case, the public service rules are very, 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 very clear. Now, for training, yes, training has limitations, but training does go a long way, especially when we are dealing with officials that were probably recruited decades ago, before some of these laws even came into existence. So we just need to, on our side, provide that assurance that DHA officials are all properly trained in LGBTQIA plus related matters, so that when they come with such, when they come across such cases, they have the ability to address them accordingly. And then there was also the issue of displacements in foreign countries, and how DHA could reach out to those entities to see if they cannot resettle people back. I think I like the suggestion. It's a good one. Of course, it would involve involvement of a number of stakeholders, but luckily South Africa, our consular and foreign missions footprint is quite well established. So it would definitely involve our missions in these various countries, then engaging with those local communities to see what can be done, instead of having people just being in limbo and backlogged here without a way forward for some of them for even a number of years. So I will definitely put that suggestion in my notes when I give my report back. Thank you very much for that. Winston.
Yes.
Yes. So Winston asked a question, excuse me, relating to communication, or how we communicate to new asylum seekers the relevant information. We have a dedicated communications branch that oversees all the communication at the Department of Home Affairs. We make use of multiple channels to reach out to people. And of course, people may have different experiences, but however, I am aware that even in our ports of entries, there is visibility of in relation to access to information. So perhaps maybe if that's not adequate, we are open to suggestion to say, in addition to your typical platforms that you have as Home Affairs, can you also do 1, 2, 3 that we believe would actually go a long way in reaching people that may not necessarily have access to any of your communication channels? I think our communication team would very much appreciate that. But we're active on all social media. Actually, yeah, majority of social media platforms, we have those. There's also physical engagements, but as I mentioned, even though we've got the head of the communications branch is dedicated here at head office, there is national footprint in terms of officials in provinces. So again, we're open to suggestions if you have anything in addition to what we are already doing. And then okay, I think those are the only have I covered everybody? Maybe let me just check. In terms of questions, Busi?
Yeah, can I come in quickly? So, thank you very much for answering those questions. There are 2 questions in the chat box. I'm just going to read them out to you. The first says, it's a suggestion or a question that asks if there's a possibility for the department to create a database in each province for civil society to be part of the LGBTI And if there is one, who should they liaise with in the office and the name? The second question is asking about the issues of backlog that you mentioned. They asked if
Mm.
this has been resolved, and if yes, how does the Department of Home Affairs communicate with those who have been stranded within the backlog system? Which I think is an excellent question. Thank you.
Can we go back to the first question, the one about a database?
Yes, so I think from understanding, it's asking that it's proposing for a provincial database of civil society organization that can be turned
All
into,
right.
yeah, you
Okay.
got it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I could be wrong, but I presume that it won't even be starting from scratch with this one. We could liaise with, I think DSD has got a list of NGOs and NPOs. They may be dealing with other issues and not necessarily LGBTQIA plus community issues. But I think that could be a place to start, especially if we're talking social issues. And then okay. So I managed to get into the chat. I wanted to just see for myself. Now, could we create the databases? If they do not exist within DSD, I think yes, we can, or we can in collaboration with them and other entities. And as for whom should we liaise with, especially the office name. So for provincial, if these databases were to be set up, then the provincial DHA offices would probably be the best place to liaise with. But then I think those would have to be set up first before you start liaising with them about a database that may not yet be in existence. This would take a little bit of time, but it's worth it because it won't just be dealing with LGBTQIA plus community issues. But there would be other government entities involved that this very same community may need assistance from or may need clarity on issues relating to those departments. Very interesting suggestion in my view. And then the second one says, is the backlog issue resolved? No, we are resolving it. It's being resolved. It's one of the current minister's priorities to make sure that the backlogs in different DHA spaces are resolved. You would recall a few months ago, he embarked on resolving the visa application backlog that was finalized just in time for Christmas. And now they've moved on to this one, the ones at Rasa and Skra, because they were actually now affecting even the policy proposals that we were putting on the table. And everybody was saying, you know what, maybe resolve these backlogs and then see if you still have this issue, see if it still exists. If it does, then you can take further steps. But I can assure you, it is a priority. So I know that in the current financial year as well as in the next, because those it's very high numbers, since they're not just focusing on LGBTQIA plus asylum seekers and refugees, but the entire asylum seeker population in South Africa, as well as the incoming ones. So it's going to take a bit of time to resolve that, and I do not want to get in this meeting and give you a specific timeline that could be wrong and misleading. But I can assure you that it is a priority for the department and definitely for the new minister.
Thank you very much for answering those questions. And we also do thank you very much for your time. We know that you did mention you do have to leave. So thank you very much to get so far with us. We appreciate it. We will now be moving on to the
Thank
next
you.
pleasure. We'll now be moving on to our next speaker, who is Wendy Isaac, who is a senior gender and justice an international law fellow at the City University of New York's School of Law. Wendy, over to you.
Thank you kindly. I'm turning my camera on for a second. Okay, you know what? Never mind. Let me keep it off. Thank you for this opportunity. I am grateful to the Southern African Liaison Office for extending this invitation to me and the fellow panelists to discuss this important topic. I think before I start, actually, maybe let me just quickly say that it's a clear sign of living in a vibrant democracy when we can have a government official like the colleague who just spoke from Home Affairs who readily and willingly admits to challenges and, or rather, the profound challenges that the department is facing in dealing with backlog of cases and just routine failure to implement laws as they are articulated and stated. But the reality is that, speaking from civil society perspective, we've been hearing of these challenges for more than 2 decades. So it's good to hear that these challenges are being acknowledged. It's good to hear that training is going to be provided. But yeah, this is the script from Home Affairs for the last 20 years. In any event, now that that's done, I had to get that out of the way. Let me also just quickly say that sure, right now I'm with CUNY Law School, but I've had the privilege as a South African human rights lawyer and citizen to work in this country for many years in the LGBT sector, from the early days or latter days of the National Coalition up to the time it became the Equality Project, where we litigated on same-sex marriage, got the Civil Union Act. And during that time, these are the early 2000s, up to mid-2000, obviously, we were receiving reports or people were coming into our office, the Equality Project in Yeovil, asylum seekers from different countries. Primarily at the time, it was from people from Zambia and Zimbabwe seeking asylum. And the challenges that some people are reporting, or African LGBT asylum seekers are reporting in 2025, are very similar to challenges they were reporting in the mid-2000s. So I just want to put that on record, first of all. But I also want to just state at the outset that I've spent maybe the last one to say maybe 12, 15 years conducting in-depth research on human rights violations perpetrated by state actors, non-state actors, or even rights violations that are committed with state acquiescence in several African countries. Notably in Nigeria, Ghana, Malawi. And I'm naming these countries because many asylum seekers in South Africa, LGBT asylum seekers, are coming from these country contexts. And I've produced reports on violations of the rights of LGBT people and looked at or monitored human rights abuses of LGBT persons in Rwanda, Tunisia, Zambia, the Gambia, Tanzania, Senegal, Uganda, etc. So when we have this conversation on this topic and LGBT asylum seekers in South Africa, we're not just talking, as South Africans now tend to call us, just the alphabet people. These are real people. We're dealing with real people's lives, people who are fleeing persecution, which is very, very real. And I want to remind us all, in fact, in mentioning this, that we have the privilege as South Africans of being citizens of a country, as the Home Affairs speaker noted, that provides the most expansive legal protection for LGBT people, perhaps the best in the world. And I'm glad that former Minister John Jeffrey's here, because he'll probably say more about this. I mean, I think we have the best legal framework in the world, most certainly in the Africa region. And I'm saying that because I want to especially emphasize that this means that we have a high level of moral and legal responsibility, not only to respond and be ready to engage in efforts to protect African LGBT asylum seekers, but to also have a very clear understanding of what kinds of repression and persecution are our African brothers and sisters facing in the Africa region. I'm going to ask the moderator to please put up a map that I shared with Lily earlier, because I need us to be very on the screen. I need us to be clear of exactly what we're talking about. But before we look at the map, let me just say heads up to and a huge acknowledgement to SALO, obviously, for convening this conversation and for bringing us together to reflect not only on this specific topic, but also to remind us that there's an African Commission Resolution 275. This is great. It's not common practice. It's not routine for human rights organizations to talk about, mainstream human rights organizations to talk about Resolution 275. So huge clap for SALO on that note. I've asked this map to be put up because I want us to be very clear about what we're talking about, or what countries, or how widespread rather is persecution of LGBT people across the globe. You'll see here there are sub-regions on the African continent that are marked in red. Obviously, this is a map of the world. There are 65 countries across the planet that still criminalize adult same-sex conduct. 31 of those countries are in Africa. 41 of the countries across the globe that criminalize same-sex conduct also criminalize same-sex conduct between lesbians, which is a topic that we barely touch on. And I'm putting this on the table because we saw in the beginning there was always talk of gay men. We've transitioned to let's talk about the trans community, and what's the group of people that have fallen through the cracks as usual are lesbian and bisexual women. And I want to make this point very clear here, that many of the African countries that you see on the map that are marked in red have in the last 10 years introduced penal provisions that criminalize same-sex conduct between women, when in the past they did not. In their colonial era laws, they did not criminalize same-sex conduct between women, and now they do. 12 countries in the Africa region that criminalize same-sex conduct impose the death penalty. Sorry, not 12 in the African region, but 12 countries across the globe. In the Africa region, we have northern Nigeria, where the death penalty can be imposed, including on lesbian and bisexual women, in Somalia, Mauritania, and Uganda. 14 countries criminalize gender identity and expression, or transgender expression. Across the continent, criminalization, discriminatory laws, hostile social attitudes, lead LGBT people to flee their countries. And where do they come? They come to South Africa because, most significantly, we have a protective legislative framework. We have a constitution that is protective, and we are bound by international treaties, international and regional treaties that we have ratified. Now, let's take a look. No, in fact, let's quickly consider what are these countries, which are these countries that are most relevant for this conversation, because when we look at LGBT asylum seekers that come to South Africa, there are some countries that are quite dominant. Let's look at Zimbabwe, and I'm glad that there's someone who intervened talking about being from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe criminalizes sodomy, carries a penalty of up to 1 year in prison and a fine. We're relevant. In Malawi recently criminalized same-sex conduct between women. It didn't do that before. The penalty for same-sex conduct in Malawi is 14 years. So when you see an LGBT person identifying as a gay man or lesbian from Malawi in South Africa seeking asylum, they are fleeing possible criminal penalty, or rather prosecution and criminal penalty of up to 14 years in prison. It's quite real. Tanzania is incredibly frightening. There's same-sex conduct, penal provisions that criminalize same-sex conduct for both men and women. In Tanzania, and we see many LGBT asylum seekers from Tanzania in South Africa who are trapped in our system, which is slow and where there's a massive backlog, who have been subjected to various forms of arbitrary arrests, Forced anal exams of gay men is commonplace in Tanzania. Mass arrests, raids of homes. In fact, many of you might have heard of or followed the arrest of South African human rights lawyers who were arrested and detained for 14 days in Tanzania for convening and running a human rights workshop for LGBT people. So when you see LGBT people from Tanzania in South Africa seeking asylum, it is a real threat to their lives. From Zambia, we know that the issue of same-sex conduct carries a maximum penalty of up to 14 years in prison. I mentioned Zambia in particular because when the former speaker talked about backlog of cases, the department is doing the best that it can, people are being trained. No, when I worked at the Equality Project in 2004, we were supporting a gay man from Zambia who was seeking asylum. When I left the country, I was gone for 11 years. I returned. This very same gay man was still in the system seeking asylum. And this was what, 14 years later. In Nigeria, same-sex conduct is prohibited under 2 items of legislation, carrying a maximum penalty of 14 years in prison. In northern Nigeria, the maximum sentence is death by stoning. So let us just get over our xenophobia when we think about why certain people or people from Nigeria flee to come to South Africa to seek protection. And I'm mentioning these specific countries because I've done work in these countries and I've interviewed colleagues who've been trapped in these countries and need to flee persecution. In Somalia, where I spent 2.5 weeks, same-sex conduct is prohibited. It carries a maximum penalty of 3 years in prison, again, for both men and women. Sharia law is implemented in Somalia, and the maximum penalty is death. Now, again, we see Somali people seeking asylum, not just LGBT Somalis, but generally Somalians. And we need to understand as South Africans that they are fleeing for their lives. In Ghana, I spent a lot of time in Ghana. It broke my heart. And I did extensive research there. What is happening in Ghana, or rather, what is about to happen in Ghana, is incredibly frightening. There are penal provisions that criminalize same-sex conduct between men. There's been a bill that's been in the system for the last 3.5 years. And if that bill is passed under the new government, it will be more stringent and more punitive than the Ugandan Anti-Homosexuality Act. So let us be very clear that we have a responsibility as South Africans, as civil society, as human rights lawyers, and our own government has a high level of responsibility to engage with LGBT issues and LGBT African asylum seekers in a manner that is responsive and that is protective. Now, let me get to, and I know that I've spent a lot of time looking at context. We all know South Africa is a destination for African LGBT asylum seekers. What we don't know as human rights lawyers and activists is the pressure and the stress and the trauma that African LGBT asylum seekers experience or go through to even get to the border of Musina or on the Zimbabwe side, to be able to get to South Africa. The stories that have been documented by organizations like Human Rights Watch, even Women's Legal Center, Lawyers for Human Rights, and Amnesty International are absolutely terrifying. And the manner in which people are persecuted, not just in their countries, by their family members, by state agents, but also by people who transport them, just to be able to get to South Africa. And then what happens when they get here? They arrive and they are not only subjected to a system that doesn't necessarily function in ways that are responsive to their trauma and actually implement the Refugees Act and regulations as is required, but also by a South African society that is not only xenophobic, but also homophobic and classist. So they end up in a very similar situation from which they've escaped. Let me just try and tie this together. I'm glad that the official from Home Affairs clearly articulated South Africa's legal obligations. They set out in the Constitution. They're very clear. Constitutional provisions, the Equality Clause, provisions relating to the respect for human dignity, provisions relating to promotion of equality and any other, well, let me just be clear, protection from all forms of violence, whether perpetrated by the state and non-state actors, those provisions apply to every single person finding themselves within the border of this country, whether or not they are citizens, whether or not they are seeking asylum, whether or not they are LGBT. And so when we look at our Refugees Act and the regulations, and in fact the act as amended, we need to think very clearly, is the act being implemented in accordance with the constitutional provisions? Now, many of you may have seen, I mean, I started to read it last night, but the Western Cape High Court, and I'm hoping someone else in this meeting will touch on this in greater detail, but the Western Cape High Court, I think it's the 16th of May or 2 weeks ago, last week, issued a decision declaring certain provisions in the Refugees Act that relate to non-refoulement as unconstitutional. This is a case that was brought by Lawyers for Human Rights and the Scalabrini Center, looking at ways in which the provisions of the Refugees Act as amended and its regulations may render may expose people to harm, and the provisions around non-refoulement are actually not in compliance with our constitution. So our constitution, I've already mentioned the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, but let me focus on two things, because this item of legislation is absolutely directly relevant to the work of refugee status determination officers. Oftentimes, they'll be very ready to admit as a department that their officials need training, that sometimes they don't understand the issues, that sometimes they don't have enough information. But in fact, what we know, and this is documented by human rights lawyers and reporters, is that African LGBT asylum seekers approach these officers, they state their cases, but they are treated with a level of bias that is absolutely unacceptable. They're not given sufficient information. They're not properly considered when their cases are presented. When decisions are made at the first instance of applying for asylum, I've spoken to colleagues from different countries who've said these decisions are not even set out in writing. The law requires that they be set out in writing, and they are not. Now, let's circle back to what does the Constitution require of the Department of Home Affairs, and what does the law state, in addition to whatever the Refugees Act might articulate. At international level, this is the easy part. International law is very clear. In any event, the South African government, and as a country, I said I would not say this, and here I am saying it. As a country, we are required to ensure that South African law is in compliance with international standards and treaties that the government has ratified. So what do we have? We have at the top of the list, Article 14 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, but more precisely, we have a convention on a convention relating to the rights of and status of refugees, and a protocol that accompanies that from 1967. We also have a regional treaty in the African region, convention governing specific aspects of the refugee problem in Africa. You rarely hear our government officials talking about this convention. South Africa has ratified almost every single international human rights treaty that is applicable and relevant to our treatment of asylum seekers in the country. But beyond international treaties that can be used by lawyers when they litigate in our high courts, or when we do advocacy at a regional level or in the UN system, there are also very specific guidelines, international guidelines that have been issued for or to enable Home Affairs officials to do their job properly. These guidelines, and I'm not going to go into details because I know I'm probably running out of time. You have the UNHCR guidelines on international protection for claims that relate to refugee status based on sexual orientation and gender identity. You have the Yogyakarta Principles, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. The Yogyakarta Principles entrench the right for individuals to seek protection from SOGI-based persecution. Now, this ability or this right to seek protection means that if I'm from Somalia, I have the right to seek protection in South Africa because I'm being persecuted on the grounds of sexual orientation. We should be using these international guidelines. Also, the Yogyakarta Principles confirm the right of every LGBT person to live free from criminalization and sanction, and to be entitled to state protection from persecution. I've just mentioned the number of countries in the Africa region that criminalize same-sex conduct. Again, I know we also reflecting on Resolution 275. That's very clear. What is good to note about the South African context is that you see efforts from government departments, whether it's the Department of Justice through its extensive program for the last, I think, 15 years, looking very carefully at how LGBT persons are protected in various items of legislation in addition to the Constitution. We've seen how they've pushed for policies that relate or that are applicable to LGBT asylum seekers in South Africa. I'm talking about, for instance, the I think it's the National Strategic Plan or Policy on Racism, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. I think John Jeffrey will probably touch on this in greater detail. So what I want to say about these guidelines, whether they be international guidelines from UNHCR, the Yogyakarta Principles, Resolution 275, is that our government officials are aware of these guidelines. We know that they are aware of it because in my context, as someone who's worked in an international organization, we've had conversations where they've stated that they are aware of these guidelines. So, for instance, if you look at, there are two cases that I dealt with I think it's about 2.5 years ago, of two gay men from Tanzania who were in the system for about 3.5 years. Their asylum application was eventually rejected, and it was based on the fact that the RSDO official did not believe that they were actually gay. That's the first point. Did not believe that they were actually being persecuted because they were never arrested, that they never spent any time in detention. Did not believe that they would not be subjected to persecution if they were returned to their country because, let's see, there have been no reports of arrest or prosecutions in Tanzania. Now, the actions of our Home Affairs officials go contrary to guidelines that clearly set out what it is precisely that the government or government officials should be doing to ensure protection. The last point that has come up repeatedly in some cases, and I'd like you to take a look at reports produced again by the Women's Legal Center and Lawyers for Human Rights on this topic, is oftentimes African LGBT asylum seekers in particular will be asked by Home Affairs officials, how, Manje, you were fleeing from, let's say, let me take a random country. Oh, you've been persecuted in Accra, in Ghana. Why can't you just go to another city? Why can't you go to Kumasi and find protection there? Or let me take another country that's more familiar. You've been persecuted in Harare. Why can't you find refuge in your own country, in Bulawayo? These are questions that our Home Affairs officials ask asylum seekers in this country, and there are very clear guidelines that are set out in international frameworks and in regional frameworks that say that that is unacceptable and that should not be permitted. I am going to conclude by saying we have a legislative and policy framework and international standards that our government has signed up to. We have a vibrant, active civil society, but we live in a country that is riddled with homophobic tendencies, with racist tendencies. Now we're seeing that coming out of the woodwork, more so now than ever. And we need to recognize that the majority of people LGBT people seeking asylum in South Africa are Africans who come into this country and face these multiple forms of oppression. And so when we engage with this topic, let's factor in race, let's factor in class, let's factor in the fact that we continue to have systems in the country that are not necessarily as protective as they claim to be. I am going to finally really conclude with saying there are various other forms of engagement, and I can hear someone breathing, so I will stop. Thank you. kindly for listening.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for that rich discussion. And I think it's really always important to touch on the lived experiences of people. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to be moving on to our next speaker, which is Miss Winston Barakalungi from the Haven Pride of Africa. Winston, over to you.
Thank you so much, Siwe. Let me introduce myself again. My name is Winston Barikolunji. I identify as a trans woman sex worker, and I'm a newly arrived asylum seeker here in South Africa. And here to speak. Okay, sorry, thank you. Let me just turn on my video. Sorry about that. Let me repeat. My name is Winston Barikolunji. I'm a trans woman sex worker, newly arrived from Uganda and currently in South Africa. And I'm here to speak on behalf of Haven of Pride, a newly established organization that is dedicated to supporting transgender and queer asylum seekers in South Africa. We mainly offer support to individuals who have been forcibly displaced due to their gender identity, fleeing from violence and persecution. And I'm currently volunteering as a programs officer at the organization. Our mission at Haven of Pride is to lift up and support transgender and queer asylum seekers by providing safety and dignity and empowerment. And we achieve this through offering safe shelter and support, ensuring for easy access to essential services to the asylum seekers, and we foster for inclusive communities through building connections with new communities and the people. And also we support integration and acceptance of the transgender and LGBTQIA asylum seekers in South Africa. So I'm briefly here to share about my personal experiences and that of other LGBTQI asylum seekers in South Africa. I personally have realized that even in displacement, there's still many barriers and risks and challenges that remain in place, especially for individuals like me, who remain often marginalized and excluded. Number one, the most pressing issue I'm going to raise is the broken asylum system, whereby I personally have suffered firsthand discrimination. I've been to the Department of Home Affairs once, and it has been not good for me. It has been a bad experience. I've had to suffer long queues, and then you have to wait for so long. And there's the bias from the officials, like it's been raised by the previous speakers. And then also the second issue is access to healthcare. Firstly, living undocumented in South Africa is a major risk. Firstly, it exposes us to detention, arrest, and harassment from the officials, and it also denies us the freedom for movement. And when you take a case scenario, I personally, when I got here, I had some health conditions, but I couldn't go to the hospital because I live in constant fear of being arrested or reported because of being undocumented. And then that really puts my life at risk and other health conditions. And also the second issue is economic barriers. When we look at the root cause, it's all being undocumented because we cannot access economic opportunities as asylum seekers. And this is leading to the cycle of dependence to repeat itself because we leave our countries running away from persecution, discrimination, exclusion, rejection. So we get here to South Africa thinking we are going to rebuild our lives and gain independence, but that has not been the case. It's always different, whereby you find yourself, you're struggling with thoughts of survival and safety in a new country, trying to navigate the asylum system is also hard, being that there's lack of information on how you can even access or go to the Department of Home Affairs, or what do they need, what are the documents, and this is all bringing about confusion to we the newly arrived asylum seekers here in South Africa. And also the next issue is safe housing and shelter, nutritional support. You find out, for my case, when I first arrived here, I didn't have a place to stay. I didn't have a place to go. I was so confused. And in being in a new country where you don't know anyone, you don't have information to access documentation of protection, where does that really leave me? It exposes us to many risks of being exploited and violated, because like you don't have direction when you arrive here. So that is really putting our lives at risk. And then we're facing another problem of mostly to emphasize on the safe shelter. There's need for safe shelter here in South Africa, because when you look at many people leave their countries displaced, disintegrated, with no next option in life. And we get here to South Africa, look, thinking we are going to have a new life and a better life, because South Africa is a nice country with progressive laws and a liberal constitution that allows us to live freely and even have refugee status. But that has not been the case. We have been denied that because of the broken system and the delays and the long waiting days. So in this case, many individuals choose to stay undocumented, and it exposes us to many risks. And also the other problem we are also dealing with is the psychological stress. After suffering the exclusion, the rejection, the discrimination, the identity struggles and vulnerabilities, we get here thinking maybe we'll get emotional healing or recovery, but it has not been the case. You always have to deal with constant anxieties. You're scared of what is going to happen next in your life. When I move out there, is my freedom guaranteed? Is my safety guaranteed? Am I even going to return home? So my recommendation to the Department of Home Affairs and like to all the speakers here, I'm like, we should address all these issues and ensure that the asylum system really favors us, mostly the LGBTQIA asylum seekers. And also another issue we are addressing is that issue of social exclusion. Because firstly, you get here and there is a language barrier. Firstly, it's going to hinder you from integrating into the community or connecting with locals. That really raises senses of isolation and also making you feel like, why did I even come here? I thought leaving my country, coming here, things are going to be different, but then because of the systemic violence and discrimination, you end up having more anxieties and other mental health challenges. And it is not really good, since you'll be dealing with past traumas and then you're dealing with post traumas in a country where you've ran to or fled to, thinking you're going to get the freedom that you've been denied from your home country. But that is not the case here. I personally have faced harassment from the officials, and with that I've learned to just keep at home, and that is denying me my freedom of movement. Because I remember a scenario where I was in an Uber with a friend and we were stopped by the police. Immediately my heart was pumping. I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna be deported, I'm going to be arrested. Why? Firstly, the bias from the officials. They were like, where are your papers? Why do you move without papers? I was like, oh my God, I am gone. So that really has denied me my freedom of moving, because every time you're moving, you're scared. Every time you see a roadblock, you're scared. You're like, they're going to ask for my papers. And that has denied us the freedom of movement and expression, because every time you move, you're have to pay constant bribes, like for you to move even in this country, like even around the places here. And that is really not okay, because most of our community members are not working. We are facing financial barriers because we don't have any, I personally have not received any help from the UNHCR, from the government. And where does that leave me? Where does that put me? It really leaves me with no other option than to be exploited or violated in order for me to survive, which is not the case. From because at the time I left my country, I dreamt of a safe country, a safe space that welcomes me and embraces me with all my flaws and all the sufferings I've faced. But then it has been a very different experience from the time I got here. I've had to deal with levels of trauma, of stress. You're always thinking, am I going to survive the next day? Am I going to go through the next day? What if a police officer comes here? What if I meet the police on my way to spa or on my way to church? So that has really triggered my emotions. And even for my fellow asylum seekers, LGBTQI asylum seekers in South Africa, it's the same issue that many of us have to stay in hiding because we lack documentations. We don't have access to economic opportunities and healthcare access. Because I personally, I can't even go to the hospital. The moment I arrive at the hospital, I'll be asked to present my documentations, which I don't have. And in case of emergencies, where does that leave me or my other community members? Meaning death has to be the only option because I can't go to the hospital. Even going to the pharmacy, you need a doctor's prescription, but I can't get that because I cannot access healthcare. And also, there is need for community engagement to deal with the feelings of isolations, because we leave our countries rejected, suffering, discriminated, left with no option. But then when we get here, we have dreams of safety, of integrity and being accepted, but it has been a different experience. So at Haven of Pride, we are trying to promote social integration for the newly arrived LGBTQI asylum seekers, to make sure that they have a sense of belonging, to make sure that they have that feeling of connection whereby you don't feel left alone, because it really gets so hard when you can't even talk to any of your community members or any of your other trans women who are going through the same challenges that you're facing. So at Haven of Pride, we have emphasized that building stronger connections and also partnerships. For example, we partner with Lawyers for Human Rights to ensure that the LGBTQI asylum seekers have access or clear pathways to the asylum system and processes here in South Africa, because it gets so complicated and stressing. And without documentations, we cannot achieve anything, we as asylum seekers, because you cannot go anywhere without a document. Like you can't access social services, you can't access essential services. So we are trying as much as possible to make sure that there are clear pathways to the asylum system, and also ensuring safety and stability for the LGBTQI asylum seekers. We do this through providing safe shelter in our capacity as we can at the moment, because we're having funding uncertainties, and being that we are a newly established organization led by transgender and queer asylum seekers, it's really hard for us to access finances to be able to sustain our programs and reach more individuals in need. And also, we are trying to advocate for protective rights for the LGBTQI asylum seekers and support mechanisms so that we can be empowered, and not only for us to survive, but to thrive in a new country that is home to us, that has given us a new place to call home, that has given us an opportunity to have chosen families in a new country. So here at Haven of Pride, we believe in the power of transformative communities, and we really look forward for transformed community and changes at the Department of Home Affairs, that the system will be easy for the LGBTQI asylum seekers in order for us to find some relief and feel at home. Thank you so very much for that.
Thank you very much for sharing your input. We're now going to be moving on to the next speaker, which is the former Deputy Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, John Jeffrey. Over to you.
Thanks, Busi, and good afternoon, or what do we know? Still good morning, everybody. I note that and thanks for inviting me to speak. I note that all the inputs have been specifically on the focus of LGBTI refugees, although the topic, I think, is a little bit broader than that in terms of policy to implementation, accelerating respect for and delivery of LGBTIQA+ rights, including LGBTIQIA+ asylum seekers. I was asked to speak a bit about the policies, the legislation, the gaps, and the solutions. So I'm going to be going a bit broader. Not being in government anymore does give me a bit more of a freedom to speak more openly. So I would make some comments about Home Affairs. But I think as far as policy and legislation, there's the National Intervention Strategy of government. It's on the Department of Justice's website. It was revised, so it's now the National Intervention Strategy for 2023 to 2027. We took this one to cabinet, so it had the support of the whole of government. We elevated a role for other deputy ministers from Home Affairs, Health, Police, in monitoring the implementation of the strategy. So that was sort of one of the changes. Also, we changed from LGBTIQA+ to SOGIESC, but that's more of a technical issue. As far as legislation, the Hate Crimes, Hate Speech Act has been assented to. It's now an act. It still has to be implemented. And there were issues relating to the treatment of or things said against people on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or sex characteristics. The areas where work still needs to be done is with Home Affairs. There is a draft Marriage Act which is being circulated and considered. It's a marriage act for everybody. So the idea is it would cover same-sex marriages, heterosexual marriages, customary marriages, and religious marriages. So all in one piece of legislation. Just with the issue of Home Affairs officials, because of the point being raised of homophobia on their part, and I did note Diketso's response, which was correct, that they're public servants, they're not allowed to express their prejudices. There was a provision under the Civil Unions Act that originally that Home Affairs officials could indicate if they had a problem with marrying same-sex couples, and they could opt out, but they had to state that up front. That has been taken away in terms of an amendment about, I think it must be about 6 or 7 years ago. whereby that option is no longer there for the Home Affairs officials. So even if they are, it's against their religious convictions, they have to conduct such marriages. But anyway, the one aspect is the Marriage Act. The other is there was a policy document on the population policies, population register policies. In South Africa, we have one of the numbers in our ID is for designates your sex. And I'm told that I think we're only one of 2 countries in the world, and I think, but speak under correction, that the other country was Denmark, that has a number in the ID number that designates sex. So 0 to 4 is one sex, 5 to 9 is the other sex. Now, what Home Affairs wanted to do was to keep that, which was not something that I personally agreed with, and I'll get on to why, but they wanted to make provision for non-binary people by making 0 to 3 one sex, 4 to 7 to the other sex, and the last 2 digits for non-binary people. Now, I personally feel that we don't need a number in our ID number to designate sex. When I'd raised this at Cabinet, I was told that it's a priority for government to advance women, which it is, and I agree with that. However, government is also advancing the rights of Black people, Black African people, and there's no number in our ID on the issue of designating race. That is something that is self-identified. So why does it need to be there for sex? But anyway, those are things that I think civil society needs to take up if they wish to. There is work that needs to be done on the alteration of Sex Description Act in terms of amending that. That has been something that has been accepted for some time as being something on the agenda, and more work needs to be done on that. And then there would also be issues around intersex babies and whether there's any surgery that's allowed to be conducted on them when they are infants, and so on. And then there would also be issues of conversion therapy, which is, I think, another gap. So for me, those are the gaps in the policies. I think that as far as, well, I think it's up to civil society to particularly take up these issues with government, and it's important to be actively engaged with government to keep the pressure up. I think things have changed for the worse in the rest of the world with the rise of right-wing parties, particularly in Europe, with what's happening in America, and the resistance and abhorrence of diversity and inclusion and equality. So I think that's making it also more difficult for money to be raised for a lot of these projects or these campaigns. On the issue of Home Affairs, just maybe to close with that, I think the problem, and these would just be my own views, that the problem in South Africa, and I hear what previous speakers have said, and the hurt and the pain that they have experienced. I think the problem, though, that both Home Affairs in South Africa has is that there is a massive influx of migrants, undocumented migrants, mainly coming here for economic purposes. But because there isn't any provision or limited provision for coming for economic purposes, it is that they then end up claiming to be asylum seekers. and that then overburdens the system and things get stuck. Also, there's a concerning growing anti-foreigner from Africa, from the rest of Africa, syndrome from many people in South Africa because of high unemployment and limited jobs. People are concerned that foreigners are competing with them. And we may not like those perceptions at all, but we've got to actually take cognizance of them. So I think the problem with LGBTIQA plus refugees, or people claiming or wanting to seek asylum on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity expression, is that the system is clogged. And I think it would be important for organizations in the LGBTIQA plus sector to lobby specifically with Home Affairs for the treatment of LGBTIQA plus refugees, to separate it a bit out from other asylum seekers, because unfortunately many of those are really just economic migrants or economic refugees, if one can call it that. So that would be one suggestion that I would have, that there's a specific focus by the LGBTIQ plus sector with Home Affairs to look at the implementation of policy and the treatment and the procedures to be followed. So I think, Busi, let me leave it like that. I think, I'll be ready along with everybody else for questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John Jeffrey. Thank you so much. I appreciate your inputs. I'm now going to be handing over back to my colleague, Lily, who will be chairing the second half of the session. Over to you, Lily.
Hi, everybody. So we've got about 30 minutes for questions and engagement. I know there's been quite a lot of discussion in the chat as well, so we can read out some of those, but we'd like to ask for people to raise their hands and come in, or you can write in the chat, I'd like to come in and speak. To find the raise hand button, you can also see the little icon that's a heart shape and it says react or reactions. You press that and there it says raise hand. So for now, please, can you all try and keep your input to under 2 minutes if possible, so we'll be able to hear everybody. Let's go first to Mandy and then to Tinashe. Over to you, Mandy.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this space. And well, I just want to reflect on what the speakers have just aired out. I would love to start with what John just said in regards to, the differences between economical migrants and the LGBTQ asylum seekers and refugees. I think, to me, that's also one of the challenges that the department is failing to recognize within their systems. I think they should be able to create like systems that are very flexible. People should be given chances to explain why they are coming into the country. I know it's really, it's a common thing happening in South Africa where different countries are coming into South Africa. But when now it comes to LGBTQIA asylum seekers and refugees, it seems like now we have been put in one box together with economical migrants and other people who are coming into to South Africa, for their own reasons, something like that. But that's something that they are failing completely to recognize. The second part of it is that last week we did have a meeting as refugees, queer refugees, and other refugees as well, with South African Human Rights Commission and UNHCR in their offices as well. So what really came out of that meeting was that the department is willing to go and visit Home Affairs in regards to some of these challenges. The backlog that they're talking about, they've been saying this backlog, I think, for quite a number of years now, and it's not even ending. We hope that maybe the department going to visit Home Affairs, because it seems like UNHCR is completely powerless. That's the fact. UNHCR says they are visitors, which is okay. They are visitors. They've been welcomed by the government here. They can't overstep on the government, but now it could be very easy for the Department of Human Rights Commission to just go and speak in South African perspective, to clear some of these challenges that are at the department. Well, when you look at the department itself, honestly, they know what they're doing. They tend to ignore these issues, most especially when it comes to LGBTQIA refugees and asylum seekers. I've been there for quite a number of times. I've been following my asylum process for almost 2 years now. I came to South Africa not to look for any opportunity, and even up to now, I'm not looking for jobs. I'm not looking for anything, but I'm looking to be documented, because I've not left my country just to be this famous person, to be this kind of person who owns resources, but I'm just seeking safety, to sit under a tree, and when the rain rains, I'm able to cover myself. The way they ask their questions, it seems like they are aware of the law. They know that LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers are coming into their system, but they just, because of their own cultural and religious beliefs, they tend to divert their own system to their own benefit. The way they ask questions is it's just there to fail you. The nature of questions they ask is to fail you and benefiting them. I'm gonna give you an example. They were asking me reasons why I left my country. So in the process of explaining, then obviously there should be a term of them requesting for supporting documents, in which I did. So me presenting my supporting documents, instead they refused to take the supporting document that supports my case. They tend like just highlight things to benefit them, but not to benefit you as an asylum seeker. That's why you see cases of rejection are happening at the department, because they are not getting fully understanding of who a queer person is, why are these people leaving their country, what's happening. They should take time to also read other countries' laws, what's happening with the LGBTQ asylum system. Thank you so much for I'm sorry for taking that long minutes, and thank you so much, everyone. Wendy, thank you so much for that summary you did in the beginning. It was quite amazing, and yeah, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mandy. Let's take the hand from Tinashe.
Thank you so much, Lily. For me, again, it's another wild suggestion. I've been reading about Harriet Tubman. She created long time ago a passageway to assist, slaves who were persecuted, etc., etc. If South Africa is really having a challenge with backlog, we're a special case, of course. I know people are saying, everybody, we are not the only ones who are seeking asylum in South Africa, etc., etc. We've got groups, organizations like UNHCR. They are extending a hand. They would like to help us pass through. But the minute you get into the system as a queer person, you are stuck there. You can't open a bank. You can get a job if you're lucky, but the 6 months, 3 months you get your renewal is hard. You can't really be part of the people who are paying tax. You are not doing anything but living on the edge. Can at least Home Affairs look into this Harriet Tubman type of solution, whereby if they can't give us a rightful will to stay in South Africa because of South African issues as well, can they allow us to pass through so that we can be in spaces or countries that can then accept us, give us identity? I don't have an ID. I don't have a passport. I'm just stuck. And my asylum seeking number is not an identity document. I renounced my ID, my passport and my Zimbabwean ID, because I can't use those here. I can't leave South Africa. I can't have them take me back because that ship sailed. Going back to Zimbabwe right now, it would be like going back to where they are waiting. The lions are waiting to swallow me. So using the simplest English and not too much terminology that's huge and big, can they try to look into a way where they can be really a passageway? If they can't have us in South Africa, can they allow us to pass through so that we can seek rightful refuge and safety in those countries or spaces that we can. It's tiring. Thank you, Lily. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tinashe. The final hand we have is from Safura, and then I think we can ask some of our speakers to also come in, and perhaps you can give your responses and also a kind of concluding message. Safura?
Thank you, Lily. It's not so much a question. I think I am picked up a couple of key proposals from the speakers and certainly from the comments in the chat. And proposals that I think SALO perhaps needs to look at in terms of some kind of follow-up formal engagement with the Department of Home Affairs around issues that have been raised in this dialogue. One of the issues that the DHA person kind of committed to looking at and agreed was a good idea is the issue of some kind of forum that will of organizations that asylum seekers can speak to and get assistance from. And I think that that's a proposal that the civil society organizations working both with LGBTQIA plus persons, but also in the migrant space, and that a serious kind of discussion needs to be held about the need for such a forum to assist. While I'm making the proposal about the forum, I do want to warn quite quickly that asylum seekers need to be very careful about being scammed, which has happened to other migrants, where they kind of organizations that say, pay a certain fee and we'll help you and we'll fast track, etc., etc. And then they pay in between from 6,000 Rand upwards. And then the organization disappears. So that is just one thing I would like to caution on. I do think that the issue of immigration, the broken system, etc., is something that we need to raise with DHA, come up with some solutions. The DHA officials spoke about some steps that they are taking. And obviously, the biggest problem is the backlog, and a solution needs to be found for that. The third thing is that I think going forward, if all organizations and individuals who have problems with DHA officials, they need to take the names and position of that official, if necessary, kind of record or make notes of the message. But we almost need to have a name and shame list that we can then hand over to DHA and say, these are your officials that are not doing their work and complying with the law, and you need to take disciplinary steps against them. So I don't know if that is a proposal that perhaps someone like Lawyers for Human Rights can take on as a task, but I think those people need to be named and shamed. The very last point is that when we commented on the white paper on citizenship, etc., the January one, and our subsequent engagements with DHA on the matter, is as SALO, we have managed to indicate that the immigration issue is not just a DHA issue, but that it needs a kind of whole of government approach, and that there are key departments they need to interact with to find solutions. So that includes the Department of Social Services, the Department of Health, the Department of International Relations, the Department of Education. So all the areas in which people are struggling to gain access to social and economic services. And they've already started a process of engaging at a policy level. So Diketso, as Director of Policy, is engaging with the policy teams of the other departments. And I think we need to push for that to continue. Yeah. So those are my comments. Sorry, it did take more than a minute.
Yeah, much
So yeah.
appreciated.
So yeah, but I'd really like the name and shame. I'm calling it that, of the officials. And I think it's not only LGBTQIA plus persons, but all migrants who are beginning to experience that issue need to do that.
Thank you. Thank you for those putting together those suggestions that had come forward and proposing your own. Much appreciated. So thanks everyone. I think we're going to now go back to our speakers and give them a chance to respond to one another's input or to give your parting shots from this discussion. Also with the understanding that we need to continue to have these conversations. So I think we could just go in the order that we first spoke in. So if I can ask Wendy Isaac to come in, please.
Thanks. Thank you, Lily. I'll be very brief. Thank you, everyone, for making the time to listen to us, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this conversation. I extend also my gratitude to the other panelists. It's always quite an important learning experience to hear from colleagues who are deeply involved in this work. I have only two parting comments. The one is that if we, from our respective positions of whatever limited power and resources we may have, to encourage or find ways to encourage our people, South Africans, to stop using degrading terms, like things like the alphabet people, number one. That's just so demeaning and degrading, and you see that very often on social media platforms. The second thing is being informed and being educated about exactly what happens to African LGBT asylum seekers in their respective countries, and then what happens when they get here, and how they are treated in our country is heart-shattering. The final thing is we still, whatever the nature and shape of our government is right now, it's still fairly decent compared to others. And there's still hope for us to get to a much better place in terms of how we treat vulnerable groups. And I'd just like us to I'd like to encourage us to remain focused on these positive developments while we work with the challenges that we need to address. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now let's please go to Winston.
Thank you so much again. I really want to extend my gratitude to all the speakers and the participants on this call. And I want to thank you, Lily, for giving me this opportunity to speak on this platform. And lastly, my ask or recommendation would be for the Department of Home Affairs to develop clear and accessible guidelines for LGBTQI asylum seekers, and also facilitate for easy understanding about this complex asylum process. And thank you so very much. And Have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks for those suggestions and very much for your input and telling us about your experiences. And then finally, can we call John Jeffrey?
Thanks, Lily. Yeah, I'd made suggestions in my input, just responding to some of the points made. I think Sephora had made a number of practical proposals which I think should be looked at. The issue of look, I mean, there's UNHCR. I mean, UN, the UN Organization for Migration and for Refugees. I think they could be engaged, but I think it really is engaging with Home Affairs to say, look, as far as LGBTIQ plus people, queer people from the rest of the continent, let's look at the policies you follow when you interview somebody. Unfortunately, bureaucrats are concerned about, well, they would be concerned about people claiming to be queer refugees when they're heterosexual, and that's not a basis. They're scared of people getting in. Yeah, and I think often, and I think that's a sort of fairly standard bureaucratic approach. They don't realize that I think for most people from the rest of the continent who may be heterosexual, to claim to be gay or lesbian or transgender is not something that they can do easily. So I do think there's a lot of scope for engaging Home Affairs on the procedures. And I do think I would suggest that those proposals are taken up by organizations in the sector, by SALO, and that there's a coordinated approach and engagement with Home Affairs on the matter. So let me leave it like that. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody who participated.
Thank you so much, and thank you for those points. Yeah, I think from our side, on behalf of SALO, we just like to say thank you very, very much to all of our panelists. We really appreciate your very, very rich inputs, and yeah, we're going to try and produce a policy brief, kind of a document from the discussions we've been having today, and I think all of us will go forth and try our best. I know there's a lot of organizations represented here to be advocating for our community, the queer community, and Sephora, did you want to come in before I close?
Yeah, sorry to do that to you, Lily. I think some of the actions in addition to the policy brief, some of the actions we can work on almost immediately, and that it's takes the form of formal communication based on this dialogue. So one of it is I put a proposal in the chat group where I'm saying we can also use the data provided by Wendy in her presentation on the laws and penalties in African countries. So, while we're preparing the policy brief, we actually take that part of Wendy's presentation, and we send a formal letter asking if within the backlog and the broken system, can these countries be prioritized for the following reasons? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, I think that's wonderful, and I'm glad you came in and said that. And I think, yeah, especially the legal instruments that Wendy referred to, but I think a lot of the other aspects of the discussion as well, we can contribute to that kind of a document that we can send through to the Department of Home Affairs. So I think it's a great idea, and we can take that forward. And yeah, we look forward to more conversations and more work in this regard. We'd also like to thank from SALO's side our partners, the Constitutionalism Fund, who made this dialogue possible. And thank you to everybody who's engaged and attended and listened. And that would be all from our side. Just a very warm and grateful thank you. And have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Lily. Goodbye.
Thanks, Lily.
Thanks, Lily and SALO. It's been great. Thank you.